Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Let's get talking about your issue. Let's see how we can integrate them into your psychology. We have an audience member this week. Everybody help me welcome my dog Gertie. If you hear any background noise of it sounds like somebody licking their paws. that that explains it. That's can't cut that out. You know, if there's a leaf blower outside, I can cut that out in post, but the freaking dog licking her paws, that's too much, among other things, right? That's what dogs do. Yeah, let's get to it. You know, we have just a fundamental conflict going on now in society, in the individual, right? Like the conflict going on in society is what's going on in the individual. We have this lower part, we have this higher part, and up until relatively recently, the dominant philosophy has been, well, you have to let one win out, or these are like two opposing ideologies. You know, your mind and your body, and in a sense, morality, being a good person, is using the mind to just stamp out the body, to just repress aspects of the body, which led to a lot of sexual conflicts that Freud and then Jung talked about. But now I think we're starting to see, thanks to Jung. I mean, Jung did a lot to extirpate the mind-body dichotomy from psychology, but not fully. But I think we're slowly, getting rid of those latent pieces of the mind-body dichotomy, so you can actually, it's not about trying to be good or bad or anything like that. It's how do I incorporate who I am and become a whole person. So all these things that you think are bad about you, all these inherent conflicts, maybe they're not conflicts. It's just conflict in perspective and how you look at your psychology. So let's get at these, unifying factors of your psychology to help you, really master this stuff. Right? This goes back a long way, and I think Jung would argue it's even part of your unconscious. Like, you're born with it, right? That's the collective unconscious. Not ideas so much, but simply patterns of behavior, ways of viewing the world. Not that they disconnect us from the world, but just we key in on certain parts. And the mind-body dichotomy. This goes back to at least the Timaeus, but really before then. So that's what we're working on here, right? And I think we're seeing that in culture now, right? It's like a mind-body dichotomy thing going on. We have two sides that don't really seem to be talking. Really, what's going on in culture is a sexual conflict. Yeah, that's what's going on in American culture right now. Is this guy who is, he's been with his wife for maybe 10, 15 years. They have a couple kids, and he loves his wife. Oh, he loves his wife. It's great. But boy, that secretary, that 25-year-old secretary who, just started working for him. Now he thinks he needs to somehow create an outlet for his sexuality on that secretary, not his wife, right? That's the mind-body dichotomy. But I don't think that's true. I think this is about integrating. This is about connecting with the wife, not as a way to repress those feelings for the secretary. By the way, if there's an issue with the wife, then fine, divorce the wife. But if there's no issue with the wife and you feel like, right, the Madonna whore complex, you either see women as Madonna and whores, then we can integrate the sexuality, but the way to do that is to really integrate your emotions. Really see how, these lower emotions that we typically view as lower, like anger, especially anxiety, depression. These are all extremely useful tools. And I don't want you to get good in spite of your depression. I want you to get good, not good, but whole because of the depression. So thank you for that. Also thank you, 800 subscribers. Maybe at some point. I think last time I checked it was $7.99, but we may be up to 800 by the end of the week, or maybe by the beginning of next week. So thank you for that. Thank you for tuning in. It feels good. Feels good to know that I don't just have to be talking to my freaking dog. I would just talk to her. That's fine. But hopefully we can talk to a little bit more people than that, because we're all dealing with these issues. We're all doing things that we don't want to be doing. And how do we stop doing that? Right? And how do we, I used that phrase on Twitter this week. I thought it was good. I think I got it from Jung, actually. But that phrase, psychological incontinence. We're talking about dogs here. A dog that's housebroken. Right? What does that mean? It means that it has control over his body. When it has to go pee, it comes and looks at you and it goes, hey, well, what are we doing here? It's time to go outside. But a lot of people don't have that with their psychology. I barely had that with my biology this week because I did carnivore for these past 5 days, and I really did it for sleep. But it does some interesting things downstairs, let's just say. But yeah, I was working. I thought it would help with sleep, and it really didn't. I kind of slept the same amount, but I guess I feel better, even though I'm sleeping the same amount. So, whatever. I guess I'll take that as a win. I mean, it's like I really want a prettier girlfriend. Well, you're not going to get a prettier girlfriend, but what you can do is drink 6.5 beers, and she's going to look better. It's like, okay, well, I guess this kind of solves the problem. That's me and sleep regarding the carnivore diet. You guys know what that is, right? You just eat meat. I don't know. Like nobody knows what that is, but on certain corners of the internet, just of course, well, everybody's on doing some kind of paleo primal carnivore thing, right? That's just how this works. So I don't know. Hopefully, I'm losing some fat in my face. Yeah, that's really the main reason. I was watching the show last week, and I'm looking at my face, and I'm just like, dude, what are you doing? Did you just like eat a full a bowl of salt? Anyway. So 100 subscribers, thank you for that. Let's keep sharing the message, how to integrate your psychology, and we're going to continue to do that today. I want to go over volume 5 of Jung's collected work, Symbols of Transformation. Just want to be clear, I'm not a Jungian, but Jung was a huge influence on me. And I think there are ideas in these books that, a lot of people just won't get to. It's not because you're stupid. I mean, that's what Jungians would say. There's problems in that community precisely because Jung has not fully extirpated, I'll keep using that word, Jung has not fully extirpated the mind-body dichotomy from his philosophy. Yeah, there's a good tweet that I replied to a couple weeks ago. Something about, when you really get into these self-help, self-development, woo-woo, Sedona kind of communities, you get a lot of really damaged people who think they're better than everybody. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, that's what the mind-body dichotomy does, right? We're the mind to the body that is society, and when we're just better, and you do get some of that in Jungian circles, but it's for a very simple philosophical reason that you just haven't fully extirpated this idea. You haven't fully expunged it from your philosophy. However, Jung is a great bridge between Freud and I think where psychology needs to go, and I would not have my ideas without him, that's for sure. We're going to be talking through some issues here. I'm not going to go through all of it because I think it's like a 500-some page book. It's like 600 paragraphs. So we're not going to get through all of it, but I think there are just, key things in this book that are important to talk about. And I would encourage you to read it, of course. I have notes on it. Maybe you guys, if you want my notes, just email me and I'll send them to you. I mean, they're not complete. They're really not meant to be notes so you can just read them so you don't have to read the book. It's really meant in conjunction with reading the book to just maybe make it a little bit more seamless reading through it. But there are these ideas in this book that kind of fit well with some things that I talk about, specifically adult development. So Symbols of Transformation, Volume 5. So there are symbols in our unconscious that are, throughout all humanity that in effect show us, or at least indications of what we need to do to transform. That's why you're tuning in to some degree. It's not to hear me talk about what foods I've been eating this past week. It's you want to transform in some way, and there's actually symbols that help us with that. I talked about a little bit this week with the church up there, with Notre Dame and why the church is feminine in nature and what that means about our transformation. That is in this. We will get to it. Got a question on the anima integration video about just to elaborate more on the anima, femininity, maybe womanhood in the church and what all this represents. We'll definitely get into it. But so there's this micro transformation that Jung is talking about, where I talk about the macro transformation. That's what I've been talking about with my stages of adult development. Jung has his stages. I don't think they're as good. We won't get into that now, but my stages of adult development are, first you separate from the parents, then you get good being alone with friends. It could be friends or alone too. That works. Sexual initiation, emotional initiation into a relationship. That's the guy who he's with his wife, but he loves his wife and she's great and they have kids, really happy, but there's the secretary there. And I'm not saying you're not going to be attracted to that secretary, but if are really considering acting out with that secretary, and you think that's going to solve something, that is a sign you've been sexually initiated perhaps, but not emotionally initiated. Right? There are still things you're holding back with your wife, if she is indeed good for you. This all presupposes that. So there's the sexual initiation, emotional initiation, and then generativity, right? How do you take what you learn throughout these stages of initiation and give to the next generation in a sense? Part of that is having kids, of course. Part of that is just, volunteering at some community center. But what Jung's talking about in Symbols of Transformation is how to go from one stage to the next. And it's the same transformation process going from each stage to the next. And, he uses symbols, of course, because the concretes are going to be different, but the symbols are going to be the same. So there are these symbols of transformation going from one stage of what I would call adult development to the next. Now, I think the one that we're going to focus on predominantly when we're talking about Volume 5, Symbols of Transformation here, is separating from the parents, because that is where the symbols are the most concrete. So, Volume 5. This was written when Jung was 36. This really represents one of the first separations he has from Freud. Jung and Freud, they were going to do the psychoanalysis thing together, but, Jung had some misgivings, and then he started to talk about what he really thought, and then Freud kind of cut him off. And it was mutual, but I think it was mutual, but really I think Freud was more the one who was just, I don't want anything to do with you. You are going to corrupt this field of psychoanalysis. And from Freud's perspective, that's correct. But I think Jung delves into something deeper. Really, what he does ultimately is he unifies the mind and the body. Now, we can talk about that in a bunch of different ways. Like he thought that libido wasn't entirely sexual in nature or power-driven, as Adler thought. He thought it was just an energy, and there's a sexual element to it, there's a power element to it, but maybe sometimes it's not about sex or power at all. It's just about your psychic energy, and has nothing to do with these lower parts of us, these lower sexual parts of us. And then, more explicitly, an integration of the mind and body. He thought, well, how about we use this unconscious, we use what's there, and actually assimilate it into our lives in a healthy way. Let's come up with ways of doing that. Now, he wasn't that concrete about it, to be fair, but not as concrete as I am, with my anxiety and anger diagrams. That's ultimately what I'm doing. It's just the next iteration of Jung, I would argue. But hey, let's look at symbols. Yeah, let's look at symbols that keep occurring throughout humanity, and use that to think, well, what could this mean about us? And people think that this is faith-based to do this, like, oh, you just have to take some things on faith. It's really not yet. There's that. I remember that debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. And Sam Harris he thought he got like a gotcha on Jordan Peterson, but Jordan Peterson didn't do a good job defending himself. It was, in a sense, Sam Harris going through a cookbook and creating symbolism out of each instruction in whatever recipe it was, like lasagna. So you're cutting up the sausage into 3 pieces. Ooh, the 3 pieces represents the Trinity. That's not really what's going on. I mean, people have that view of what Jung was doing, and hermeneutics, right? Literary symbolism, literary analysis to figure out what's going on in our psychology because of what we read in the Bible or other ancient texts. But it would be strange if in every cookbook, whenever they tell you to make lasagna, they always tell you to cut it up into 3 pieces, the sausage up into 3 pieces. Well, then that might mean something. And what if there are various cookbooks across different civilizations that seemingly had very little contact with each other, if at all? Maybe back in ancient history they had contact with each other, pre-Diluvian. I don't want to get into that, but maybe there was some pre-Diluvian contact with each other, but that was it. Yet in all their cookbooks, they're always talking about lasagna, and when they talk about sausage, they're always saying to cut up in 3 pieces. Well, now I'm thinking maybe it does have something to do with psychology. Maybe it means something, especially because food is so important to our psychological health. Not just eating the food, but the communal aspects of it. So that's what we're talking about here. So this is Jung going back through this, and look, I agree with everything Freud was saying. That's what Jung was saying, but I think we just need to go a little bit deeper. And so part of the separation from Freud comes about in the first bit here. Yeah, we're not going to get through all this, that's for sure. I mean, I wasn't going to get through the entire book anyways, but now we're definitely not going to get through this. Anyways, this one section is just two kinds of thought. And this is, in a sense, a way to shake out everybody from Freud's empiricism. So Freud was a strict empiricist. He was a materialist, right? He took the body of the mind-body dichotomy. And what Jung is saying, Jung was more of a student of philosophy than Freud was. And Jung's looking back at philosophy, and there's actually two kinds of thinking. There's directive thinking, concrete thinking, and then there's imaginative, symbolic thinking. And all Freud was doing, and what really limited his perspective, he wanted to be scientific. And this is where you get criticisms of depth psychology still to this day, as people think, oh, well, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's scientific. Look at the science. Yeah, but it's just actually one part of science. There's another part of science that includes philosophy, and that is, well, what do we do with this data? How do we integrate this data into ideas, which is what the scientists do anyways. They just don't know they're doing it. The scientists are influenced by the dump truck. The scientists are influenced by philosophy too. They just don't know. So it's even worse. They're influenced by this thing. They have this bias, and they don't even know that they have this bias. Not that it's wrong to have bias, but when you're unaware of it, then it really becomes a problem. And Jung's saying, hey, there's this other kind of thinking that Freud did not get into. Imaginative, symbolic thinking. Basically, how do we look at the concretes that Freud was dealing with, and how do we turn them into abstractions that we can really use? These are going to be the symbols of transformation. Freud, I think, was genius when it comes to observation, to empiricism. But the way that he put it together is just completely useless, ultimately. I mean, it's useless if you want to evolve and really transform. He has this superego, this ego, and this id, and they're constantly in conflict. What? That's... So all you can do in therapy, all you can do to grow from that perspective is go to the therapist, talk through repressed issues. Freud would argue specifically repressed psychology. And then you overcome the neurosis. But Jung even goes on to say, well, that's not true. Like we have people who do this and go through the and process, clear out, chimney sweep. That was the first metaphor. I use the metaphor of clearing out the crawl space, but the first metaphor for this analytical process was sweeping out the chimney. This is talk therapy, actually coined by one of the first patients of talk therapy. Her name was Anna. I mean, that's not a real name, right? But I think that they called her Anna. And that was Brewer's patient, right? Not Bluer. I think there are two Swiss psychologists. There's two Swiss-German psychologists. Bluer, he was the first one, then Brewer. That was Brewer's patient. She's like, oh, it's like sweeping out the chimney, right? And all she had to do was talk through these things. And, at that time, they were doing all these cures like, electrical shocks or cold baths or, long walks. And not that stuff doesn't help, of course. Like, not like cognitive behavioral therapy techniques cannot help. I think we'll get into it. Somebody had a question about NLP techniques. I got through Twitter. But so there's this other way of thinking, and really this is the origin. So this was written, so Jung was 36. So this was, he started writing this in 1900, when was he born? Yeah, so I guess it was 1911. He started to write this. But, there's been several editions since then. And this is really the origins of what Jung means by sensing and intuition. Sensing is just looking at sensory experience, and that's, a great way to process the environment. But there's also intuition. How do we develop concepts in effect based on the senses that we see? Concrete versus abstraction. That's really what's going on. And then he goes, so this is paragraph 113. So the Enlightenment, Jung argues, was really a shift from thinking symbolically, thinking as a religionist would think, or a medieval scholastic would think, thinking in abstractions only, to empiricism. And Jung says, look, this is a great shift. And, this is part of the mind-body dichotomy, empiricism being the body, rationalism, idealism being the mind aspect of this. And Jung says, great, this is a great shift, paragraph 113. But what happened is we kind of explained away religion as, it's not concretely real, therefore it doesn't exist, therefore it doesn't matter. Let's just move into empirical science. Science. and then we discovered the scientific method and everything. And he's like, yeah, that's a great shift, but we can't leave the symbolic thought. So where psychology needs to go is we need to look at the symbolic thought as though we were scientists looking at concrete facts. That's the idea here. That's what he's doing in Symbols of Transformation. Yeah, there's just other great paragraphs around here. We won't have time to go too into it, I guess. Just talking about myth as a collective dream, which I think is a good way of putting it. It's like a dream that we're all dreaming. That's what we're doing when we go and see a movie, right? I guess there wouldn't be that much meaning in it, to reply to Sam Harris for Jordan Peterson. There wouldn't be that much meaning in it if it was just one movie or one story or one play or one book of the Bible, whatever religious book. But if these same themes keep coming up and people make other stories that don't follow this structure, don't have these themes, the themes that he's going to go in these symbols, and then they don't last. Well, why is that? Well, they must be saying something about us. This isn't mysticism. This is actually empiricism, but just empiricism about something that we previously thought didn't exist and didn't matter because it didn't exist concretely, materialistically, but it does exist. And it can still be just as important, especially when we're talking about our psychology. So fantasy, I guess we won't get too into this part. So a lot of this book goes into a patient that Jung didn't have, but somebody else had, and they sent Jung his notes, their notes about this patient. And she goes by the name here, write down a real name, Miss Frank Miller, who was this well-off, educated young woman. I mean, it's crazy the kind of references she's talking about. She's talking about Cyrano de Bergerac, which maybe was a big play at the time, and Job and Paradise Lost. And so she's spending a lot of time alone on this trip throughout Europe on this boat, and she starts to have these fantasies. And really what this is, well, it's important because later this Miss Frank Miller girl, this 20-year-old girl, she has she becomes schizophrenic. So really what these are fantasies that are really the beginning of schizophrenia. So let's look at her fantasies. Okay, so we have this well-read woman who's writing poetry and reading Milton. What's going on in her fantasies, and how could this be a lens into our psychology? And she compares herself to Job, and Job. Jung just says a lot of great things about Job, so there was this officer, not a captain, but an officer on this ship, this Italian officer who she developed a crush on, but she couldn't. She couldn't let herself go there because she was still so attached to her parents. I mean, she was the proto-millennial, living in the basement. I mean, I think her parents had a lot of, resources. So what's the point of moving out? She's still very attached to daddy, even at 20, so she can't create a relationship with the Italian officer because she's still attached to daddy. So all she is doing is projecting out this relationship as symbols. She talks about moss, she talks about the sun. We don't have to get too much into that. I want to go specifically to the transformation. I mean, we can get lost in a lot here, but there's just lots of good things. We don't have to get into everything. All right, so let's go back. So this is section 4 of the second part, where he really gets into the symbols of transformation. A lot of the Miss Miller stuff, talking about the two different kinds of thinking, that was just an introduction to get us ready for what he's going to be talking about. And the first thing he's going to be talking about is the origin of the hero. Oh boy, I'm going to have to cut out a lot of this, I think. So the hero is essentially libido symbolism. It is symbolism for our psychic energy. It is symbolism in the sense we are projecting out, and a hero is the change that we need to go through. Right? Well, maybe this seems obvious to us now because we've all been reading a bunch of Joseph Campbell, but it wasn't obvious back then. Heroes are actually representing something for us. That's why it's so important. It's not simply entertainment. Why are we still talking about Oedipus? Because it indicates something that we need to go through, or in a sense, not go through, right? It's a warning of what not to do. And there's a great analysis here of Oedipus and the Sphinx, the riddle that the Sphinx gives. And I've never heard this interpretation before I read Symbols of Transformation, but Jung essentially says, what's so interesting about the the riddle of the Sphinx is it's so easy. Anybody could get it. But the Sphinx puts it out there. Like, oh, wow, Oedipus, you're so smart. Very much like now what we would call the Oedipal mother. And you think she tells you you're smart and all these things, and then you have this fantasy of how great you are. But where does the fantasy lead? Well, you already killed your father, right, on the road. Now you're going to go marry your mother, right? That's the trick that the Oedipal mother gives. Right? Very much like Hansel and Gretel, the witch, feeding him up. Oh, it feels good. Thanks, Mom. Telling me how smart I am and how good I am, and you're feeding me all these cakes. But really, what she's doing is she's fattening you up so you can't leave. It's like a psychological, intellectual fattening up. This thing saying, "Oh, wow, Oedipus, you're so smart. Oh, you're such a special boy." Well, you don't want to leave that. Right? That's very comforting. And so in section 5, we get into symbols of the mother and rebirth. So this is where I was going to talk about symbols of the mother. This is where church comes in, caves comes in, mothers as cities. I mean, mothers of cities are frequently referred to as feminine. And we think of cities being harlots too, like Sodom and Gomorrah, right? If they let a lot of intruders in, the city is slutty in a sense. She's a harlot. And the symbolism comes from, there's like this sense of protection. And I think that's really what the church is about. Sanctuary, especially back, in Notre Dame of Paris. Esmeralda, I guess we don't do this anymore. In some respect, not as unofficially, it's not so much a part of our culture, but churches are a place of sanctuary, right? That's why they couldn't arrest Esmeralda in Hunchback. Very much like a protective mother. And Jung's not, decrying this. He's saying this is good. This is the first part of transformation, is being in the mother. And when you go through other initiations, if you go from solitary to friends, if you go from, let's just use that example. You go from solitary to friends as part of that initiation. It's difficult to make new friends. So a lot of what you need to do is you need to come back to the mother, right? To the solitary nature of, living in your apartment by yourself as a way to recuperate. But if you want to be a hero, you have to somehow break out of that. You can't just stay in your solitary state. You can't just stay with your mom. You can't stay in your church. That's why you only go to church once a week. You can't stay there. It's easy to be a holy man on the top of a mountain, but that's not the challenge. It's how do you come down from that? How do you integrate your unconscious? How do you integrate your body into your mind? That's what Jung's talking about. And he's like, well, wait, stories have been telling us to do this forever. And he's not just using Miss Miller's fantasies. He's referencing, a bunch of other stories. So yeah, Paradise Lost and Job and the Myth of Hiawatha, which is just this poem by Longfellow. All symbolizing the same thing. So that's, the idea of the mother. We have to go back into the mother. It's not wrong. If you want to go live at home in your mom's basement, Jung would say, great, do it. But how are you going to, in a sense, separate from that? You need to go live in the mother. You need that sense of sanctuary. I get it, but you gotta, if you want to be a hero, if you want to be this thing, this libido projection that we all have, then you gotta figure out how to separate from that. Oh yeah, from paragraph 405, Diogenes living in a tub to express his freedom from desire. You guys know that Diogenes, the Cynics, right? The precursors to Stoicism. Stoicism is a philosophy of, staying in the church, of staying on top of the mountain, of staying in your mom's basement, psychologically, intellectually. It is, in a sense, removing you from the environment. And yes, Stoicism comes from cynicism. Yeah, Diogenes, that's what he's doing. He's living in the tub. This is libido regression, right? And it's just self-satisfaction. He's just living out this mind-body dichotomy. The world is corrupt. I'm going to go to a higher place. But Diogenes, also peeing in the street to show his contempt for society, he's going to just live in a tub. So then we have the battle for deliverance from the mother. And I didn't think I was going to get this far, actually. Oh, I want to get to your question. So, I want to talk about Jung more, but to improve on what I was doing before, I think with volume 16 or 17. I don't want to do too much at a time. So that was just the origins of the hero, the symbolism of the mother, what it really represents, and how we need to go into that psychologically in order to come out of it. And that's what I talk about, with my theory of emotions, right? So there are emotions, and a lot of guys do the stoicism thing of, just forget about emotions. But really what you have to do is you have to go into the depth of your emotion, go into the anger, go into the sadness. And in there is the information that you need to come out, to fully separate. And that's what the hero does when he's in the mother or the whale, another symbol like Jonah and the whale, and also very similar symbolism in Hiawatha. You go into the mother and there's a treasure in there, right? There's a treasure that you couldn't have gotten outside of the mother, outside of the whale. And you can use that treasure to not only detach yourself from the mother, from the previous stage of initiation, but you can then use that to go on and make your be able to flourish in the next stage of development. So staying in a solitary state, that's great. It's great because it gives you a sense of sanctuary when you're out trying to make new friends, and it's stressful, and like interpersonal skills are foreign to you, and it's emotionally stressful. But also, what treasure do you get in when you're alone? Or you're supposed to get? It's more difficult now because of the internet. But what are you supposed to get when you're alone? You're supposed to develop a relationship with yourself. You're supposed to enjoy being around yourself. So when you go out and make friends, they're more likely to like you, right? But if all you do is spend time when you're alone, if you spend time on YouTube, I mean, obviously this show is okay, but anything else, it's wrong, right? YouTube or internet porn or, video games, whatever. Well, you're not really getting, you're in the mother, so to speak, of solitude, but there's a treasure there you're not looking for. A treasure that you need not only to separate from that situation, but to use in making friends. Same thing with separating from the parents. I mean, there's a treasure. There's a key in being with your parents. That sense of regulation, that sense of, here are these two people who can accept me no matter what I do. And I get it. A lot of us didn't receive that kind of emotional nourishment from our parents. So, in adulthood, if we didn't separate properly from our parents, perhaps, not blaming the parents, but they have some issues that they haven't dealt with. So we have to go back and, in a sense, separate ourselves. So then we take that, we take that sense of regulation that allows us to go into the solitary stage. And when we have a sense of regulation in that solitary stage, in a sense of acceptance, the healthy kind of acceptance, not acceptance leading to stasis, but acceptance leading to, further, more reliable action in the future, then we're able to do that. So, next time I talk about this, we'll talk about the deliverance from the mother, which is sort of what I mentioned, the importance of the dual mother, what a dual mother and a dual father represents. It essentially represents you having both a mortal life and an immortal life. It represents you yearning for something bigger than you have, mortal and immortal. I mean that psychologically. You have this concrete life, but you also have this spiritual life. And you have these two mothers, and part of the sacrifice, part of separating from those two mothers is really reconciling that relationship. And then the sacrifice is, you sacrifice the short-term gratification of being with your parents, of being in your mom's basement, of being alone, of having a bunch of friends around but no girlfriend, or having a girlfriend but not really taking that into a more emotionally deep direction. And then being with your girlfriend, long-term girlfriend or wife, if you decide to do that, and not using all those things that you've learned in the previous stages to give back and to communicate with other people about all these great things, for nothing else, at least of what you've gone through. So those are the symbols of transformation. We'll get to the other three symbols, the deliverance, the dual mother, and the sacrifice in another episode. But you had these questions, so I don't want to not get to those. So I got a question on this past YouTube video of intuitive nudges, and what those are, and if I could have some examples of them. Just like the problem that Freud saw was sexual in nature. He saw a fundamental sexual conflict because what was society dealing with at the time? It was coming out of the Victorian era, and where sexuality was really repressed. So he's like, well, what's going on in culture is what's going on in the individual. Really, what neurosis is a single manifestation of the problem we're dealing with in culture. And so what's the problem we're dealing with in culture? Right? Why are people protesting? Why are people not listening to people who are protesting? It's same on both sides. It's a validation issue. And I think if I can boil it down to what's going on right now psychologically in everybody is just a lack of inability to validate. So I think it's very telling. I'm not criticizing this person for asking this question, but I think it's very telling that like intuitive nudge, what even is that? Goes back to what I was talking about last week. Always being in survival mode. Always running off of fear. Fear of not getting something done, fear of your boss saying something, fear of not making rent, fear of your wife or girlfriend thinking something about you if you're not making enough money or if you're not doing enough to improve yourself. Oh, I better get in shape, otherwise people aren't going to like me. Right? That's survival mode as opposed to this is what I want. This is what I want for my life. I think we're so tuned in to other people's expectations, just even unconsciously. Like intuitive nudge, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. And it's very difficult to explain. I would say if you have a difficult time with intuitive nudges or you don't know what I'm talking about, then it's really time to, right? What do I say when you meditate or journaling? What are the two most important questions to ask yourself? Well, first, what are you avoiding? And then the second one is, what do you need? I think you're too concerned with what other people need and not so concerned with what you need. And I think the better you get with this, even in small instances, even if it's just calling a friend or sending an email, and yeah, if you have a difficult time with that, then you're just, I know you have these intuitive nudges, these feelings of maybe I should do that. I mean, I had several this week. I could talk about some examples, but just send an email. There was this email I wasn't sending, and I just got this blip in my consciousness, like, oh yeah, I got to send that. Right? And then I sent it. I mean, is it that big a deal? Well, no, it's not that big a deal. Well, it is a big deal in the sense that now I'm developing this relationship with myself of I'm looking inwards of things I need to do as opposed to what does everybody else want me to do? And that generalizes eventually to what does everybody else want me to be? Well, I'm going to end up being what everybody else wants to be. What wants me to be, I'm not going to be who I want to be. Then you're much more likely to have that midlife crisis I wrote that article about. And if you have that wife and the new secretary moves in, you think, oh, that's the solution to my problem. Because you're tuned out. So I don't know, how else to talk about this, but you just get feelings, you just get little nudges to do something. And we have this thing where we think it needs to be a big nudge. But just look at little nudges. And again, like I was saying in the video this week, it's not going to be the right thing to do all the time. But it's not about that. It's about creating a better relationship with yourself. Like, why do you need to analyze your dreams? It's because your dreams have all the answers all the time. And it's like, well, I think it does, usually. But that's not even the point. The point is you're just creating a better relationship with yourself. I think I was saying this a couple of weeks ago. Jung would even have his patients paint or draw their dreams. These are terrible paintings, but it doesn't matter. By drawing your dream, what are you telling yourself? Like, I'm cultivating a relationship with me. That's, in a sense, going through the solitary stage in a successful way. That's one example of doing it, as opposed to just being tuned out on the internet and whatever Hulu. The myriad of distractions that we have now. You get a feeling to do something and you do it. Now, I know I can tell you guys to do that because you're not sociopaths. Most people aren't. Most people, their life will go in a much better direction when they start doing what they really want to do as opposed to being in survival mode. But the problem is not only are we in denial that we have these feelings, these nudges, but we're in denial of the fact that we have denial, right? So it's just like 2 stages removed. We don't even feel that we don't feel it. But I'm telling you, it's there. And look for it. Start with journaling. Start with asking yourself what your needs are. How do you want to plan out your day? And that's what we talk about in group all the time. Like, what routine do you want for your life? And I'm not saying you have to wake up and do the same exact thing every day, but in general, there should be some kind of structure for your day that satisfies your needs. Obviously, in conjunction with other people's needs. That's what a mature need is. And then you get little nudges within that framework. I mean, that's how my wife's visiting her parents this week, so I had to freaking go grocery shopping. That I was relying on intuitive nudges because I had this overall framework of what I want to eat, right? So I was just going to eat meat this week. So I'm going to the grocery store, so I'm working in this framework of I'm just going to eat meat, but I don't create a shopping list. Actually, it was too bad because I forgot to get eggs, but I don't usually create a shopping list. It's just like I just walk around the meat aisle and it's like, what do I want? You know? And that's usually what's going to be good for me to eat. I'm going to be most satisfied, probably not biologically, but psychologically, shopping that way as opposed to, ooh, I need to eat this, I need to eat that. Well, what if something comes up, you know? So we got the other question of how church is a woman. We got into that. This next question is how to overcome issues with your dad when he's dead. Well, I talked about this a couple weeks ago, you know, how to get over daddy issues. And I think the first step in that is every issue that you have with your father, whether it's a resentment or fear or an issue with him growing up or issue, you know, something. Well, first what you do is you go and you talk through those issues quite thoroughly in therapy. That's really the point of therapy. Now, I know a lot of therapists don't do that, but that's really what you need to do in therapy so you can process them, become more comfortable with them, right? Going back to the mind-body dichotomy, begin to assimilate those seemingly lower parts of you, you know, those resentments, those fears, those frustrations that you have with your father. You begin to assimilate that. Maybe even take some responsibility for it, dare I say. And then you go and you say those things to your dad. And that's what you do when your dad's dead. But instead of saying those things to your dad, what you do is you just write him a letter. Not as a way to blame him for anything, right? You're not coming from that place, but you're writing the letter as a way to, look, Dad, there are these resentments, for instance. There are these resentments in our relationship, and we can't have a full relationship unless we talk about these resentments. It's it's the most normal thing and healthy to have, it's normal to have resentments, then it's healthy to talk about them. So you're coming in from that place because I want to create a better relationship with you, Dad. But he's dead. You can't do that, so you can't write him a letter. And I've been part of this experience before. I have that case example in my book, Man's Guide to Psychology, where somebody had to do that, not with their dad, but with their ex-wife. And writing a letter is very therapeutic. And that's not my idea. That's just really what works in that situation. And in addition to that, you know, what's the ultimate point of, or what's the ultimate way, to incorporate or to overcome father issues is to get better with your anxiety, right? Incorporate your inner father. And you can do that, obviously, regardless of whether your father is alive. So the only piece that's missing, it's definitely not a lost scenario at all. People, really want to get helpless about it. And I'm not accusing you of this, dear listener, but if you do feel yourself like, oh, well, I have all these issues with my father, but he's dead. I guess there's nothing I can do. If you do have that sense of helplessness, of victimhood, of, perhaps self-pity thrown in there, then that would be your payoff for not reaching out and not communicating. That would be your payoff for holding on to those resentments, for holding on to that anxiety, because that sense of victimhood, that sense of self-pity, right, doesn't feel good, but oh boy, it's powerful. Oh boy, it's powerful, and we can get used to it. That's for sure. All right, and another question here. We have one more. We won't get to it. We'll get to it next time. It's all right. Do I have any advice for somebody who quit smoking a couple months ago and dealing with, negative issues that come up? Well, the way to deal with negative issues. So why are you smoking? You're smoking to soothe yourself. You're smoking to soothe, I would say, typically anxiety that you have. It's a very uncomfortable feeling walking around with anxiety. So you can either smoke, do drugs, or, create conspiracy theories. So the first thing I would say is this is in no way unrelated to anxiety and how you manage it. So incorporate your anxiety. What are you avoiding? What threats do you need to confront? So, that's really where you start. But I also think you're just saying, like, how do I deal with just the discomfort of it? Well, smoking, right? Smoking is a way to soothe yourself. So if you want to give up smoking, maybe it's healthy in the short term. This is, I think, a great use for drugs. Even if the drugs do cover up our issues, like something like Xanax, for instance, which doesn't help us process, which doesn't help us interact with the world, but it does just kind of tamp us down. And that can still be effective as long as we're in therapy working on our issues, which I think is a point that I forgot to bring up when I was talking about antidepressants. And I was kind of saying, everybody's criticizing them. They're not always good, and people definitely overuse them, but man, they're helpful. And if you have a problem, it can help to at least try it. Even if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. No long-term consequences. I don't think I mentioned this, but obviously you need to be in therapy. You can't just take an antidepressant and expect to get better. In fact, you definitely won't. But if you're in therapy, if you're working on your issue, if you have a good idea of what your issue is, and you just need a little bit more emotional freedom, let's just say, you just need a little bit more willpower to get you out of that rut, then an antidepressant is great. But if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know what your issue is, if you don't know what emotions are, or why you're stuck in the rut in the first place, and then you go on the antidepressant, it's not going to help. It's all about context, right? So I think that's a great way to incorporate other things, like maybe CBD oil. Man, that's a healthier one. Or marijuana edibles. They have those where you live. There's just lots of things. You can go on a walk. You can I don't know, like exercise, just a bunch of ways to soothe yourself. Just, you don't have to get those from me. Just look up how to soothe myself psychologically. There's a bunch of ways. Now, of course, if you go and exercise or if you get hooked on edibles, there's a chance of getting hooked on these things and then becoming the new habit. But as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you know that you're using these things as a crutch, as a way to just kind of break you out of that straitjacket. Now, when you're using the edibles or you're exercising, you're still in the straitjacket, which is fine as long as you recognize that you're in it. And as long as you're doing something to just continue working on your psychology to tap into your anxiety a little bit more each day or each week. Because, I get here and I talk about, confront your anxiety. Well, you don't know what you're afraid of. Some of that stuff is really tamped down. That's why we have therapy, right? That's why we have group. So yeah, I'll leave it there, guys. Thank you for watching. That's how you transform. We'll get more into it. Maybe not next week. I'll see what else comes up, but I'll talk more about symbols of transformation in another episode. Let me know what you think. Animus@animusempire.com. If you have any questions, concerns, we do free 30-minute consultations. animusempire.com/schedule, and I wish you the real trinity of your psychology, the three fundamental values, which of course are pain, joy, and reality.